Welcome to our video editing tutorial. Today we're going to be using Adobe Premiere, which is part of the Adobe Creative Cloud suite of programs. And it is what is installed at the College of St. Elizabeth's Computer Labs. So if you have access to that, feel free to take advantage of that. It's also considered the industry standard for most journalistic film editing, video editing. So that's what we're going to go with today. If you have other editing programs you're familiar with, you should be able to pick this up pretty quickly. For example, I use Final Cut a lot in my own work, and I find the two to be very similar with just a few layout differences and a few terminology differences. But we're going to go ahead here with Premiere, and when you open it up, you should select New Project, and this is what you will see. So we're going to give it a name, we're going to give it a place to save to, and then we're going to hit OK. Now, what you're going to see is a whole lot of confusing panels. So I'm going to try and make those less confusing. The first thing to know is all of these panels are entirely customizable, so you can move them around anywhere you want. Right now, we're not going to move them around because that could get very confusing very fast. But if you don't see a panel that you feel like you should be seeing, you're going to want to move them around, or you can know that it's customizable. So the first thing you'll want to pay attention to here is this Project and Media Browser panel. Each of these are nested here. The Media Browser is how you're going to find your files that you want to import into your project. You can do it the old-fashioned way where you actually find folder by folder every single file that you want, or you can do it the quicker way, which ultimately once you find them here and import them, they're going to show up here in your project panel. So if you just have the project panel open, you can go and drag and drop any of the files that you want. So you can see here, just for example, I have a couple of video files, I have a couple of still images, and I have an audio file that we can tinker with. Now, once you have these imported, you'll want to preview them. So you can double click or you can drag, and it'll show up here in what's called the source window, the source monitor. And the source monitor is basically your before picture. You can scrub through the timeline. You can play. You can go to the beginning, go to the end, all of the normal controls. And this is where you'll be toggling most of the effects and most of the any manipulations you do to the clip. One of the things that you'll want to do is probably set an in point and an out point. And the very easy way to do that is if you play and say you want it to show up starting here. I don't know why you would want to cut them off mid-sentence, but let's say you want to start them here. You put the playhead here, and all you have to do is hit I on your keyboard for in. And you'll see it crops it to here. And now when you hit play, it'll start right there. And same with out. If you want it to end here, you hit O for out, and that'll crop it there. So now when this gets dragged into your timeline, and here's a perfect example of what I was talking about the confusing customizability. The thing you will want in this space is a timeline. This is your audio mixer. So the timeline is not here. If you are missing anything important like a timeline, go up to Window, and you can see all of the possible panels and anything that's selected. So I'm going to select timeline, and it's going to show up kind of in a random spot, and I'm going to drag it right over here and nest it with the audio. So now I have a timeline. The 5 things you should have, are the Project and Media Browser panels here, the Source panel here, the Timeline here, and then the Program window here. So what we're going to do, we just imported, we double-clicked, and it showed up in the source. This is the before. We marked an in and an out, and then we're going to drag this into our timeline. Now this gives us something we can manipulate into an end product. So this is basically what your user is going to see at the end. The program monitor is that after. So this is the before, this is the after. This is what you see behind the scenes as you're working. This is what they see when you export. So this is your preview window. Same as when you double click to get it to show up here, and any manipulations you made were saved into that original clip. If you want to just manipulate the instance of the clip that you dragged into the timeline, you can double click that here, and that will show up in your source monitor. And now any manipulations that I go and add here will affect only this clip and not the master clip that I had imported to begin with. So that's especially useful if you want to use the same clip a few times, but maybe use different croppings of it or do different effects to it. You can do different things in here without having to manipulate the original file. All right. Now, we're going to show you some of the things you can do here. These are your tools. And this is what you're going to be using to manipulate the file, the clips that you drag into your timeline. You're also going to have probably a lot of effects that you're going to use, and we're going to get into a few of them. But the thing to introduce you to now is probably the most confusing and most misunderstood part of Adobe Premiere when you first start to get acquainted with it. And this is all of these workspaces. Now, I told you we've already seen how confusing it can kind of get with the layout of these panels here. And we saw how there are all these panels that aren't selected. These workspaces are basically different organizations of those panels in order to prioritize stuff that's useful for any given task. So the editing window here, the editing workspace, is your go-to workspace. That's kind of the default where you're going to be spending most of your time. But say you wanted to work with color. You might go over to the color workspace, and now you see other windows, other panels open that prioritize color-related effects and tools. Same with the effects or the audio or the graphics workspaces. We're going to go back to the editing right here, right now. All right. Now, I'm going to get rid of that by clicking on it and pressing delete, just so I can take you through this as smoothly as possible. So I've got my original clip here. I'm going to bring it up into the source monitor. I don't actually want these to be cropped here, so I'm going to just extend this all the way to the edges so that I have the full clip. I'm going to drag it down into the timeline. And now I can start manipulating it. If you want to move it forward or backward in time, you just drag. So now the video starts here, and if you press space, you'll play. So space bar, and you'll see nothing happens until the playhead reaches where you drag the clip to.
We're here live at the scene of the crime.
And of course, if you want to overlay any clips, you can drag in another clip and just plop it right on top. You'll see this divide here. Above this divide is video, below this divide is audio. So here's the video clip and its related audio, and here's the video clip and its related audio. And they're sort of mirror images of themselves. So you can almost imagine if this is a horizon line and say this is the sky and this is the water reflecting it underneath. And as you move these around, they will move together because they're part of the same clip. If you were to drop this on top, it's going to overwrite. And now that's gone. So I'm going to use Control-Z to undo. So a good way of non-destructive editing is to layer these rather than plopping them on top of each other, because that way you're not destroying anything underneath. If you want to destroy anything underneath, then that's definitely the way to do it. All right. Some of these tools are your selection tool. And this is the tool that we've been using so far to select. And then we have different ways to trim and move around the boundaries of these clips. So let's say I put this clip next to it here. So it would change over to that clip when it gets to that point in the timeline. If I wanted to change the boundary here, we've got a few options. This ripple edit tool can be turned into any number of other tools. So if you click and hold, you'll see the little arrow here. This could remind you of Photoshop, the way that those tools work as well. And so we're going to look at each of these. The ripple edit tool, when you put it at a seam, so to speak, where one clip butts up against another, it allows you to trim down where this clip ends. So it's kind of like marking the out point, but it automatically slides over everything else to the right so that we don't have any gaps. And you can see if I do it back this way, it's always shortening the end towards the beginning. So it's keeping the beginning in place and it's moving the end closer. So if I were to trim this all the way in, it just shuffles everything over, kind of a ripple effect, which is why it's called a ripple tool. On the other hand, you might not want the ends to change. So this rolling tool is going to change this boundary relative to these two clips without changing the total time of your video or the total position of the other clips around it. So now you're going to have a little bit more of this clip showing, less of this, and if I drag it this way, you'll have less of this clip showing and more of this clip. And the third option is the rate stretch tool. This is almost never useful, but sometimes it might be. And this basically, instead of trimming the duration of the clip, it trims the speed of the clip. So if you watch this clip here, you can get a sense of how fast it's moving. If I were to use the rate stretch tool, make this really small, it's going to fit all of that content into that time. Whee! All right, we're going to put that back. Now then, if we want to sandwich some clips in, so let's see, I'm going to bring this in here, and then I'm just going to put another one of these on the other end here for this example. So we've got 3 clips in a row. If we want to change how this clip in the middle is sandwiched, that's when we jump down to these, the slip tool and the slide tool. Sounds like a lot of fun, but no water is involved. That would be bad for your computer. Slip and slide tools here, if you put it on a boundary, this is going to change at what point in the clip is being shown within the frame of that boundary. It's kind of hard to describe, but if you imagine looking at a picture through a picture frame, this is like keeping the picture frame still, but moving the picture within it. So another way might be if you were in Photoshop and you were, or InDesign, and you had a cropped image, this would be keeping the placement of the crop still, but moving what you see within that picture window of the crop, moving that image around within it. So now you'll notice none of the boundaries change, but what content is within those boundaries changes. Whatever clip you have selected is going to be the one that is being affected. So here you can see the in point and the out point. So I'm kind of dragging the content to the left or to the right of those in and out points. You'll have to just play around with this one. It's a little hard to explain, but I think hopefully you're getting the impression here. The other option is the slide tool. So it's moving the crop but keeping the content. So it's the exact opposite, if that makes any sense. Before we were keeping the crop but moving the content within that crop. Here we're moving the crop but keeping the content. Now, if you need to break a clip in half, you're going to use this razor tool, sometimes called a blade tool in other programs. And this is just simply chop it. Now you have 2 clips and you can move it around, whatever you need to do. This track selection tool is helpful when you start to have more than one track here. So before I only had one track, so this single selection tool was perfectly fine, and this selects whatever I'm clicking on. This allows me to select everything forward of that, or everything backwards of that selection. So you'll see here and forward is all being selected. This is a good way to move several clips at once, because now they're all highlighted and I can drag them all at once. You can, of course, also just drag a rectangle around whatever you want selected and move it that way. All right, now I think we're ready to start playing with some effects. Some quick shortcuts that are useful to know if you need to see what's going on in any window a little better. For example, if you want to go through your media browser, but it's a little too small, if you press the tilde key, That's the dash that's a little swooshy. The tilde key on your keyboard full screens whatever panel you have open, and pressing it again returns it. So if I go over here to my timeline, tilde, and here it is, tilde, and it's back. Now, the first thing you might want to do, other than cropping your in and out or moving around your endpoints and your transitions here, is to add some sort of transition other than just a hard cut. So, for example, right here, you may want a crossfade so that it's not so hard. So what you're going to do is you're going to go to Effects. This now allows you to, again, reprioritizes your workspace so that the effects are a little bit more accessible. And you can go to Video Transitions. And you've got all these different choices. We're going to say dissolve, maybe cross dissolve, and you can just drag it right onto the transition that you want. So we're going to drag it right onto here. And now you'll see
No sign of the suspect.
it cross dissolves from one to the other. This is also how you might get a fade out effect. If you just cross dissolve, now it's going to cross dissolve into nothing, so essentially fading out.
As far as the motive goes, we aren't certain what.
Oh, of course, I have this on top. So what you're going to notice is basically this views from the top down. So since I have this on top, it's viewing that clip. When I move this out, now it's going to be viewing this clip. Now I can show you this cross dissolve. There it is. And you'll realize there's no audio here because I had destructively overwritten this audio. So this audio clip only goes to here and then drops out. So all of this is why it's important to layer vertically so that you're not accidentally getting rid of your audio when you don't want to. Here I can just extend this and bring it back if I need to. One of the things that you might notice is that when I just did that, it moved everything together. And that's kind of the default. That's what's been happening. If you click one, it moves everything together. Obviously, that's not what I would want to happen in this case. And it might not be what you want to happen if you were doing different kinds of cuts. For example, we went over in class the J cut and the L cut, where your seam here makes it an L or a J, where you have either the video transition happening before the audio transition, so you have the audio of one clip kind of hanging over into the start of the next video, or vice versa, where you have the audio change first and then the video follows later. The way you're going to do that is you're going to need to unlink these by right-clicking and go to unlink. Now we can move this freely. We could even resize this freely without having anything happen to the associated video. And so now if we moved that clip over to here, you'll see we still have the audio or lack of audio, and then it kicks in here, or vice versa. Crop this in here, move this back. The audio comes first. All right, this has gotten messy because I've been doing so much to it, but basically, let's start fresh here. I'll go back to my editing window. I'll go back to my project window. I'm going to drag this guy in. This is just so that I can make sure that this is as clear as possible. All right. Now this we might want over here, and as you can see,
As far as the motive goes,
it cuts off here. So this is an easy way to do a voiceover, right? If you unlink these selections, and then you trim this and move it over. So we're going to use the rolling edit tool. And now because we've already trimmed this, we have some wiggle room to play with. So we're going to move this over to here. And now you'll see that we'll actually have a voiceover.
the suspect anywhere. As far as the motive goes, we aren't certain what could cause someone to perform this sort of criminal act. All the people in the area can do is hope the suspect.
So that helps. All right, hopefully that has made that a little bit more clear. If you want to manipulate the video itself, for example, if this video is too bright and it's all washed out, remember journalistic standards, Associated Press style allows for only a certain amount of video editing. You want to do stuff that enhances the original video, enhances the original photo, makes it clearer rather than altering it. So if I double click this and bring it up into the source report, the source monitor here, I can go into the effects tool, effects workspace. And now I've got all these other effects that I can play around with. So instead of video transitions, I might go to video effects. I might go to, let's see, blur and sharpen, or here, color correction. We might do brightness and contrast. And we're going to just either drag it onto your timeline, or you can double click it and it'll show up on the one that is selected. So we're going to drag it right in just to be clear. And now when you go to your effects controls, you'll see you have all of the video effects here that were not there before. So now if I want to change the brightness and contrast, I might slide the brightness up and you can see it getting brighter. Slide the contrast up and you'll see the dark's getting darker and the light's getting lighter. So I don't know, maybe you find something that is to your liking. You can also have the animation be keyed to certain frames. So if you want it to change and get brighter over time, or whatever effect you want to change over time, these little animation toggles will turn on the ability to have a keyframe. So now, for example, in the beginning, I might want it to start off being that bright. And then I'm going to click to make a keyframe. And what that means is at that point in the timeline, this is what it's set to. Now if I move over to this point in the timeline, I can change the brightness, maybe make it very dark, bring the contrast up, and now it has automatically made another keyframe. So now if I go back to the beginning and play, you'll see it starts to gradually move from one setting to the next.
The suspect is apprehended and soon. I'll be here on location as more.
And you can do that with any of the effects that you choose to use. The same thing goes for audio effects. You can do a surprising amount of audio editing in this video editing program. So if you double click the audio track up here, you can also use, instead of video transitions, you can use audio transitions. If you want, instead of video effects, you can use audio effects. And you've got all kinds of things here. The most simple of which is volume. So say I want to put a volume effect here. If I wanted this to get quieter at a certain point, I can go to my effects and you'll see audio is now here. Volume is the one that I added, or this volume is the one I added. I'm going to add the keyframes. And then maybe at this point, I want it to get a lot quieter. So I'm going to drop the decibels. So now we'll see. Got very quiet. This is particularly useful if you want to do some ducking under an audio file or natural sound or something like that that might be playing over top of your video, your voiceover. So here, let's go back to my editing window, and we've got this 7th Symphony here that I've added here. And let's say I want to put this underneath. And let's take all of these guys and move them over. So we've got some music.
Thank you. We're here live at the scene of the crime, and at the...
If we want this music to be louder in the beginning and then duck behind his speaking, we can easily do that with these audio effects. So we're going to go to Effects, Audio Effects. Again, volume is down at the bottom. Drag that on. And now I can make a keyframe for the start. And I'm going to make it a little bit quieter. And then right before him, I'm going to make a keyframe, make this louder. Might be a little bit drastic, but you can see.
Thank you. We're here live at the scene of the crime, and
So if you can hear that, the audio is still there behind him, but it has ducked significantly.
thank you. We're here live at the scene of the crime.
And then you can bring it back up when he's done talking. All right, some other things you can do with the video. He's on a green screen right now. So what if I wanted him to be in a newsroom? Maybe I'll take them and move them up, and underneath him, I'll stick this newsroom. I'm going to make this newsroom clip longer so that behind him.
Thank you.
All right, so now I've got him on top of this newsroom clip. And this green screen is great because it can be chroma keyed or color keyed out to get the effect that a green screen would usually use. So if I double click this and bring it up into my source monitor here, there it is. And I go to my effects panel. I'm going to go into video effects, and we're going to look for key. Here we go. If you ever have a hard time finding these, you can also just type in what you're looking for, and it will automatically pull up the possible options. So I'm going to go with color key. I'm going to drop it onto my reporter. And now you'll see it shows up right here. Color key, I'm going to use this eyedropper. You can select the color manually, but I'm going to use this eyedropper and just choose the green. And then the tolerance, I'm going to bring the tolerance up just a little bit. And you can see the more the tolerance is, the more closely it adheres to that color you selected. So if anything's just a little bit off, it won't get selected. But that looks like it should be good. So now I've dissolved anything that's green and made it transparent. Poof.
Thank you. We're here live at the scene of the crime.
You'll recognize that in my preview window here, he's got a newsroom, but here it looks significantly cropped in. So if you zoom out, there we go. If you double click on the image, you can see that it's significantly larger than it needs to be, and we can resize it. We'll go to fit here, and you can, maybe we'll zoom out a little bit more. There we go. You can resize this image, and you can move the image around until it's the size that you want it to be. So now he's standing more in a proper newsroom. You can also resize him. Just make sure whatever you want is selected, and then you can double click it here and bring up those toggles. This is a great way to get picture in picture. For example, if he's about to start talking about this car chase and he wants to talk about the possible culprit, we may want to drag in the mugshot right here, but we might want it to be superimposed over his shoulder. So if we have it selected, double click, we can resize it, and we can reposition it into the corner. And we might even want to move him over a little bit. Now, at the point that we dropped it in,
And at this time, police are still searching the area. There seems to be no sign of the suspect anywhere.
he's floating a little bit, but that's okay. So you can see how that can work. And you can add a transition to dissolve this in, dissolve this out. And get it to be whatever sort of effect you want it to be. You can also use this resizing ability to kind of create a Ken Burns effect. So for example, if you wanted this picture of the background, let's pretend this background is being shown by itself for a little while, and you want it to be more dynamic than a still image, you can bring it up into your source monitor, and you can effect controls. Okay, you'll see position and scale. So this is sort of the more nuanced way to do it instead of dragging and toggling those handles. The position and scale, at any point, you can create a keyframe for those. So I'm going to lock it in here. Oops, there we go, it's locked in there. And then maybe at this point, I want it to be bigger. So I'm going to increase the scale, and I'm going to slide it this way, increase the position by those coordinates. And now it's another keyframe is created. So now you'll see when I press play, we get the Ken Burns effect. Ken Burns being the documentary filmmaker who popularized that, the way of cinematographizing still frame, still images. Now, a couple more things I want to show you. First thing is adding text, because you may want to add a superimposed text showing who someone is. So for example, this guy shows up, he starts talking, and then that guy shows up, and you may have some graphic underneath here, and you want to put text on that shows the suspect's name. It used to be very complicated in older versions, but luckily now they've added this text, this type tool. Just tap it and bring it right in here, and you can put in whatever you want to say. And now you'll see it created a new clip right here that can be dragged around anywhere and treated just like any other object. And if you double click it and go to the graphics panel and you select it, you can change any of the font, you can change the size, you can change all of the normal text related options. And again, remember this exists in time, so it will only be superimposed for as long as this clip is. So if you need it to stay there longer, you'll drag it out longer. If you need it to be shorter, you can drag it shorter. You can have it fade in and fade out, and you can treat it just like you would any other video clip. Now, the final thing that you might want to do is you might want to do some touch-ups. For example, this car, let's just say for the sake of argument, this car did not give you permission to be recorded and you need to blur it out. This obviously would probably be more likely on faces. We're going to go back to the editing tab here. This would be more likely on faces, but this is a prime opportunity for us to show you this. So let's see. We'll go to fit just to make it a little easier. Now, what if we wanted to blur out this car? Well, one of the nice features is that there's a way to do this without having to go and scrub through second by second and constantly add keyframes and move a blurred mask. So what we're going to do, start at the beginning. All right, there's where the car comes in. And I'm going to go to the effects panel. I'm going to bring this into my source here. And I'm going to look for blur, which is under video effects. Okay, I'll just use a Gaussian blur, that's fine. It's just basically telling you how it's going to blur it. All right, so now I'm going to go over to where I can see the effects. Gaussian blur right here. Now what I'm going to do is I want to create a mask so that the whole thing doesn't get blurred, because right now if I up the blurriness, you'll see the whole thing blurs out. So I'm going to create a mask. I'm going to toggle this mask. Let me zoom out a little bit. All right, so I've got a mask. I'm going to bring it over on top of this car. Make sure it covers the car. And I'm going to up the blur a little bit. So Gaussian blur, blurriness. All right, so now you can see we've blurred that car without having to blur everything else. Now, one of the cool things is you can actually track the mask path. So I'm going to press this play button, and you can track it forward from here. And so it's going to do all of that legwork of going frame by frame and rekeying it for you. So you don't have to sit there. You can see it's actually literally adding keyframes for every few frames. And if this is taking too long, you don't want to go through the entire clip, you can stop it at any point and it will save up to that point. So now you'll see right here, as soon as this car comes in.
As far as the motive goes, we aren't certain what could cause someone to perform this sort of criminal act.
And now that's where we left off, where the mask stays put and the car keeps going.
We aren't certain what could cause someone to perform this sort of criminal act.
All right. Now you should have a pretty good repertoire of tricks up your sleeve at this point, if you've been able to follow along. And I encourage you to check out YouTube. There are a lot of really good tutorials out there. So the last step is you're going to want to save and export your project. So if you go up to your menu buttons up here, you're going to do the file, save as, traditional stuff. That will save the project as a Final Cut, or excuse me, as a Premiere project, which means that if you open it up, you would need Premiere in order to open it, and it'll bring you to this editor. If you want to export it as a video that anyone else can actually watch, you're going to need to go to Export and Export Media. So the thing to remember here, before you do that, you want to make sure your timeline is selected. Otherwise, you may end up accidentally just exporting one clip. So the timeline is selected, and you're going to go to Export, which is right down here in the File menu. You're going to click Media. It's going to give you a bunch of options. All of these have different quality to file size ratios. Some are platform specific, some have come into and out of vogue. But H.264 is the compression codec that's going to be the most bang for your buck. This is going to end up exporting it as an MP4 file, and it's definitely the best quality for the smallest file size. For the record, almost all of these are compressed because uncompressed, lossless video files are just ridiculously huge files. So unless you're in the multi-million-dollar film industry, most likely we're going to go with something that's compressed, but as little loss in quality as possible. Then if you click on the output name, you can redirect it to wherever you want it to save. So we're going to save the desktop. I'll just call it Reporter 1. And export video, export audio, make sure all of that looks good. You can toggle these presets if you want, and there's a lot of documentation over what presets do exactly what, but generally the defaults are just fine. So we're going to go to export, and over the next minute or so, it's going to be exporting and rendering the files. And through the magic of video editing, poof, we're all done. And now, if I go to my desktop, you'll see it just created this video, which I can open in any media player. There we go.
There seems to be no sign.
Thank you for watching this tutorial. Hopefully this gives you a good idea of what you can do with this program if you choose to edit in Adobe Premiere.